Alright, we're recording. I got a basic question. Had the homework go for today. When you guys upload, are you uploading sound files so I can hear what it sounds like?
Check it out.
Yeah, that's very important. I'd love to be able to hear it. Now, if that's something I can hear now, I'll go into the Blackboard and try it out, because I sure would like to know what's going on. So let's have a looky-loo. What's going on? Biomedical signal processing and grade center needs grading. So let's do, who wants to go first? Okay. So we got this autocorrelation thing. Let's do a download. It's showing the folder, and we'll use WinZip and extract it to the autocorrelation, and then we'll find autocorrelation as a folder. And what do we got here? Original signal. And signal with noise. Oh, that's very noisy. And now autocorrelation. Wow.
Solid, right?
Yeah, that's great. Did you try it with something other than a tone?
No.
Mmm.
The Word document or pictures?
In here?
The Word document.
Oh, here.
The pictures.
Let's see the Word document. That sounds nice. So I got
The original's on the left, and then the after the autocorrelate is on the right.
sounds cool. It looks good. So now the original is on the left.
Yeah.
After autocorrelation's on the right. I see little pokies on the top, but maybe that's okay. Small artifacts. We can try this though, right?
Yeah, I have the job now.
So let's have a looky-loo. That sounds promising. Copy. And what we'll do here is drop it into the J for P directory. Any particular package?
No, the default's one.
Default package. Alright. And mouse right and paste. And it's called autocorrelation. Go over to the Java, hit project, autocorrelation, and now he's unhappy. Oh, because you put it in package sound.
Oh.
Uh-oh, now it's got a bunch of errors. As it was supposed to be in package sound. Well, you told me, I did what you told me, and then apparently what you told me was not correct. You said default package would be fine. That's what you said.
It's in my default package, but import sound. Yeah. Go to sound.
Don't. Oh, it already exists. We gotta change the name. Let's call it autocorrelation 2, and now we'll move it. Autocorrelation, because it already exists. So now what's the problem? We got to rename the file. Okay, now we can put it into autocorrelation. Refactor. So that worked. So now I can run it.
Yeah.
See, I wanted to tell you what you said because people always like it when I tell them what they said, even though I know they know what they said. And that's it.
Yeah, well, I muted the first signal. You can look at the
So now let's look at this audio input data, shall we? Now it says here I can do a U-law codec.
I took out the input audio and just used an oscillator.
I see that, but I'd like to, sort of get the input audio data, and then we can do a MAT2 truncate to integral power of 2 right in here.
Yeah, it's up there, commenting out already.
So I'll just say mat1.truncate to integral power of 2, and I guess it's going to be called input
Yeah, actually it's already on there. It's commented
audio dot get double data, and so that should do it for me. And I can put in a little semicolon, and what do you think?
Yeah, it's already there.
But yeah, but I put it in because you don't mind that I did that, do you?
No, it's fine.
I know what you
Yeah,
said.
it'll be interesting. I haven't tested this.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. That's a euphemism for what my sister-in-law calls my cooking. I'm sure she means that in a good way. So I got to find some data here.
Yeah,
Perhaps J for P, data, audio. What would you recommend?
maybe space would be good.
Space. You got it. That's very noisy. Huh. Sounds good. Yeah. Not bad. Not bad. Wow. That's very nice. So this is all done with autocorrelation, so that means we can take a look at your code and become more educated for it. Let's see. So what does this do? I got the duration of the sine wave, take a FFT, I add a little noise. Now what's going on here?
So I took the FFT just to get the oscilloscope panel of the PSD, and then I added the noise. This is unrelated. This was just to get the graphing. You could actually just comment that out if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So then I added noise from the for loop.
Okay.
You can go down.
Go down.
Then I play it with noise.
Okay.
And under ulc2.play, that's when the autocorrelation begins. Just go down. So I compute the forward FFT of the copied sine wave with the noise.
Alright, so now what do we got here? I got the sine wave autocorrelated with noise and the imaginary part.
Yep.
Now the imaginary part, is that just zeros?
Yeah, that's just zeros.
Okay, and now we get the imaginary data and the real data, and now it looks like you're centering.
That was taking the conjugate, the complex conjugate.
I see. Okay, so now you got the complex conjugate.
And then I multiplied it by the real data and summed it to the real data points. And then I did it backwards with the new real data and the complex conjugate of the imaginary data.
Okay, so this says R data equals R data times I data. That's the shorthand.
Yeah.
Okay, and now then you do the inverse fast Fourier transform. Get only the real data. Then you take the real data and you normalize it by multiplying it by 1 over n. Then you hang out for a while with a sleep, and then you take the filtered data and you play it, and it works swimmingly. Wow, good job. Yeah, that works. Autocorrelation.
That was other stuff.
Huh?
No, I was just saying the method under the work is other stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking at the other stuff now. I don't know what's going on here.
And there's stuff we did in class.
Okay.
Expulsions.
Okay. So that's very nice. Did other people get good results here? Mike, how'd you make out?
Not as similar. But, I think
Better than before?
Yeah.
Okay. Rich, how'd you make out? Good? Good. Good. Yeah, as it happens, I think we've seen a number of interesting applications now with fast Fourier transforms. We've seen frequency shifting. We've seen cross-correlation, fast cross-correlation. We've seen autocorrelation. We've seen convolution in the time domain, which is multiplication in the frequency domain, using the convolution theorem. Are there any other applications of Fourier transforms I'm missing? Yes, there's just one, and it's the spectrogram. And the spectrogram, that was the cool one, right? That showed us the colors as a function of time. We got to see different intensities at different frequencies. And one of the basic limitations of the spectrogram was that it had a fixed window in time, right? We always said, well, we'll take 256 samples, we'll do the FFT on that, then we'll move over by some overlapped window. Perhaps it'll be 100% or 50% overlapped, or maybe no overlap, and then somewhere in between, and then we'll just segment out in time. And one of the things we found out was that for a fixed sample rate, the increment in frequency was going to be a function of the window size, and that the larger the window size, the more samples we got, which meant the more frequency buckets, which meant the higher frequency resolution, but it meant smaller time resolution. So frequency resolution and time resolution traded off, inversely proportional with respect to one another. So events which are precise in time and of short interval cannot be measured precisely in frequency. Similarly, long duration events can be measured very precisely in frequency. So there's basic fundamental intrinsic limitation of the short time Fourier transform, which likens itself to what principle? Rich.
Time to frequency domain.
It's the measurement of momentum versus the measurement of position. Right? These two things trade off with one another, and that's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So the trade-off between time resolution and frequency resolution is an uncertainty principle, just like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So that basic fundamental limitation is an engineering trade-off which we cannot avoid, no matter how clever we are. Suppose I told you, well, I've got a problem where I want better frequency resolution for a very short time interval event, like a single guitar note being played quickly by Jimi Hendrix. What can I do? You tell me. You're the signal processing engineer. How do I handle this problem? I got the Ravi Shankar virtuoso performance. He's playing notes 100 notes per second. Okay, so 1/100th of a second. I'm sampling at 8 kilohertz. I only get 1/100th of 8 kilohertz, which is something like 80 samples, which means I get the entire frequency spectrum divided up into 80 chunks. Right, and that's from 0 to 8 kilohertz. Cut it in half, and now you've got like 20 increments or 40 increments on 4,000 hertz, and so what that says is that's the same as 400 increments on 40 hertz. I mean, it's not good, right? You're not getting very good. How can I improve my frequency resolution for those short duration events? What can I do? Well, I can't change. Ravi Shankar's dead. Jimi Hendrix is dead. I can't go back there and say, go up a few steps in frequency or go down in frequency, right?
But if we take fewer samples per second?
Okay, resample the analog audio input, assuming it's analog, and go to a higher sample rate. If we have a higher sample rate, then we can get better frequency resolution. So that's key. If I can do something to go back to the original audio, the analog audio, and resample it, I'm good. I can increase sample rate, I can improve my frequency resolution, I can get more buckets for the given interval of time. So that's key, right?
Narrowing the window, that's called?
Well, if you're not narrowing the window. Narrowing the window would mean changing the the number of samples that you get. And what you really want to do is, if you narrow the window, you don't want to decrease the number of samples you get. You want to widen the window. You want to increase the number of samples you get, but it'll be a window in time that doesn't change. So if you are sampling at a higher sample rate and you want to do something that samples at 1/100th of a second to get that kind of temporal position, then you have to decide what frequency resolution you're after, and then you'll be able to compute what sample rate you need.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Our time resolution will decrease when we increase our frequency resolution, right?
Well, at constant sample rate, yes.
I'm just unsure about what it means for time resolution to decrease.
Okay, if you want to decrease time resolution, what that means is you're going to sample over a longer period of time. So if you take a note, let's say let's assume you have control over the note that you're playing. Let's say it's a flute, and you want to try and detect the note, and you want to tune the flute. Play the note for a long period of time and hold it, and I can give you a very precise measure of what the pitch is that you're playing. But if you just play a very short note event, short note, then it's not easy for me to know in advance unless I calibrate my system based on the flutes and its performance. If I know, what the flute note is in advance, and you don't do anything to try and alter the note pitch, then I can re-quantize the note pitch as it comes in and say, oh, it reads in as 336 hertz, but the nearest note is probably the A440. Well, keep in mind, that's pretty far away, right? I mean, in terms of total number of notes, but I'm assuming you're not playing sharps and flats. And if I just assume you're going to play whole notes and I want to round it up to the nearest note, I can do that. I can play that game. But now you've re-quantized in pitch, and you've sacrificed a little bit of pitch resolution as a result. But if you know you're doing a standard scale, that can be a big win for you. If, on the other hand, you're trying to build a guitar tuner, you're not in a standard scale. You could be an arbitrary frequency, and you don't know if it's going to be quantized to one of the equally tempered notes on the piano. You don't know that because the guitar could be out of tune. Or maybe it's at some kind of wacky tune, you don't know. Not every tuning scale has 12 notes. The Boland-Pierce scale has 13 notes, because it uses square waves, and square waves have all odd harmonics. So to make it sound consonant, they put 13 notes per octave. Yeah?
Do you know why we use 440 hertz for A? Why that's the standard?
I do not.
Okay, I'm just curious.
It's numerology. Why should an A be 440 hertz? Someone should Google that one. I really don't know. Why is, I mean, this is not even like, why is the sky blue? Because we could have a good explanation for that. There's ozone, and that's a good one. Now, I can tell you this. They dug up mastodon bones, which were carbon dated to 35,000 years ago. And the mastodon bones had been carved into flute shapes. And they had notes, and they had scales. Now, as you may or may not know, the invention of agriculture, and that really is an invention that's important because it leads to specialization, dates back to approximately 10 to 20,000 years ago. Prior to that, we were all hunter-gatherers. They also found thigh bones that had been used to impact shoulder blades on the mammoth. So those were the drums. So they had 35,000 years ago, the original rock music, right? This is, we'll call it primitive rock, Stone Age rock, and so the Stone Age rock music, we can't really know what its role was in that society. We don't know what kind of language they had, but one thing we know, they had music. They had. So you say, well, gee, where did those A440 notes come from? Well, let me think about it a minute. If the divine covenant with Abraham is 5,000 years ago, and that's the oldest continuous religion that I know, The other ones, which date back with Sanskrit, probably from the Indus Valley, these religions were kind of discontinuous and are not recognizable today. So if I think about sort of like 10,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago, I've got no written record. This is truly prehistory as far as written history is concerned, and or anything we might consider modern history. So there's I mean, cave paintings, maybe some shadows of people's hands on walls, stuff that people found in France. You know, you could say that's written history, but that's pictograms that were made of, you know, guys hunting things that they wanted to kill and eat. You know, it wasn't really sort of like, and we built this sort of culture. So yes, sir.
It's actually like conspiracy theories a lot still kind of
A conspiracy theory? You mean it has to do with like Oswald and JFK?
It started in Austrian government where it was 432 hertz, and then by committee they decided 440 hertz. So there's like conspiracy theories as to why it changed.
Well, I actually that might not be wrong. I'll tell you why. There is a modern instrument which goes to be mass-produced, which we call the keyboard. Right? The keyboard instrument requires that we quantize our scales. Now, prior to that, we had perfect fifths, but after that, we had fifths that weren't exactly perfect, and they had to come up with compromises. The Chinese had a 144-note octave, for example. In the Sanskrit Veena, which predates the sitar, they had a solfeggio that went sa re ga ma pa da ni sa sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. In the European system, they had do re mi fa sol la ti do ti la so fa mi re do, which is extraordinarily consistent when you consider how far back that goes. And so then you wonder, well, geez, how come they had an 8-note octave, right? And this goes to the question, and this is very interesting, why are there pieces of 8, right? Well, when the Spanish were counting out doubloons, which were like an ounce of gold, they said that's too much money. Think about it. An ounce of gold in today's value could be anywhere from $1,200 to perhaps $1,700, depending upon how far back in time you want to go. 6 months ago, it was probably $1,700, maybe a little more. So then what they did was they said, that's too much money. Let's cut it in half, and we'll cut it in half again. And they did 8s. Now, why didn't they do 10? You got 10 fingers. And the answer is they used the thumb to keep track, and they just used their fingers and not the thumb, so everybody was using 8s. So 200 years ago, when they devised an open market system, an outcry system for the stock market called the Big Board or the New York Stock Exchange, they used pieces of 8 as the basis. So they had an octal-based system for doing all of the trading. This is before decimalization in 2001, which was taken that took over New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and the American Stock Exchange. Prior to trading in pennies, stocks were traded in 8s. People felt that was too big a spread, so they went to 16ths, but that didn't happen until somewhat later. So when my dad was trading, for example, everything was in 8s, and you got coffee mugs that showed all your fractions and the decimal equivalents, because a lot of times people came into the office and they didn't know their fractions. And so I still have these coffee mugs. And so as it happens, 8 was a big deal, and everybody was using 8s, and you could see it in the Sanskrit for the notation on the Veena. So that's kind of interesting. Now, turns out they had perfect fifths with the sitar, and the reason they had perfect fifths is because they had frets that could move. On the guitar, we have fixed frets, but on the violin, on the sitar, on the sarod, the sarod doesn't even have frets. Violins don't have frets, but the sitar has moving frets, which are held down with string on a gourd. And and they were able to use a 24-note octave, and so they were bending the notes, but they would have to use a phonetic change in order to show the small alterations, quarter-step alterations, as they went from one note to another. So if they had what they call the tintal, which is a small, I'll call it song, based in the saregas, it might be something like ni 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 re 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 sa, and they would alter the sa and they would go sa si, just like in solfeggio they would say do di, and if you're going that's flat, but they'd say do di when you're sharpening it, and they would, if you're going down, they would say la le in order to flatten the la. So they had a notational system that would allow them to go to the quarter steps, but they did it by ear. And they did it by ear and a combination of ear and the small changes in the way that they pronounce the solfeggio. So that's kind of an interesting idea, right?
Yeah. That's interesting because that reflects on current like Indian music vocalists and whatnot. They have those different
right.
notes that are in between two notes, what we call two notes.
Yes. Well, you know, aside from the sharps and flats, you can certainly do quarter steps. In the MIDI system, note on, note off commands are usually followed by a note number. Note numbers go from 0 to 127, but there are also mechanisms for doing glissando which allow you to inject what's called a pitch bend. And the pitch bend can get you in between notes within 127th of a step. And so then you have relatively fine-grained pitch control within the MIDI system. But if you're on a piano, you don't get that. On the Indian piano systems, because they want perfect fits, what they do is they give you a gear shift, and it shifts the whole keyboard over. That way you can play the same notes in different keys, and you can do transposition and still have perfect fifths. In an equal temperament system, what you want is the 12th root of 2 increment over the primary note. So if you want A sharp, you take A440, you take the 12th root of 2, you multiply it by A440, that's your A sharp. You do that 12 times and you'll get to 880. Because because the 12th root of 2 raised to the 12th power is going to be 2, and 2 times 440 is 880, and 880 is one octave up from 440. And so octaves are always doubles. And the reason the octaves are always doubles is because it's going to be exactly consonant. It's an exact harmonic. And so that sounds to your ear like it's a pleasant thing. So when you play A440 and A220 and A880, you can hear those harmonics as the same notes, but they come out with a timbre that sounds consonant. So that's quite interesting. We could probably do something like that with our FFTs. We could synthesize sounds, timbrally consonant sounds, by selecting the I'll call it the harmonics and how much we want to mix into them. And in fact, you don't even need an FFT for that. You can just use oscillators and add the oscillators together. And now that I think about it, I think we actually have an example of that, and it's in the I beg your pardon? There's the oscope panel, there's the oscillator panel, so there's a sine wave, here's 4 voices, right? And I can play the sine wave, or the saw wave, or the square wave, or the triangle wave, and they all look a little bit different. In theory, I should be able to let's see if I can increase this duration. Go up a little bit. So now I can get a couple of sounds going at the same time. Let's see if I can so you can hear the different timbres that result from the different waves and their harmonic content. Square waves generally have an infinite series of odd harmonics being added to them. There are other ways you can do this as well. When you add different sounds together in order to create complex timbres, you are doing what's called constructive synthesis. When you take a complex sound like white noise and then you subtract off various harmonics, you're doing what's called destructive synthesis. So there's really two kinds of synthesis in the world, constructive and destructive. That's kind of neat, actually. There should also be, yeah, here's the voice panel. Oh. Not good. Too loud. I don't know why the voice panel was giving me a hard time. It says here it's having trouble at line 155. My spectrum analyzer was kind of crashing. Why, I don't know. Oh, maybe because I was not doing an integral power of 2. Yeah, that's why. Alright, so I got the harmonic on the right. I got the sine wave on the left. I should be able to play it. Oh, or not. Oh, I have to add a little now let's change the frequency. Now let's add a harmonic and another. So now let's try just the odd harmonics. So that's kind of neat. Let's do just the even harmonics. And now we can have the different voices . There may be a theory of consonance that causes some sounds to be more pleasing than others, but the problem, of course, is that that might be subjective. And now here's a composite voice. And that's all 4 voices together. In Western music, there are 3 words used to describe the sound. One is the pitch, the other is the amplitude, and the third is timbre, and that's everything else. In Indian music, they have words to describe the different sound tones and their flavor. And so if you're playing a tabla, it's ta tika 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 ta da dong, and using that phonetic notation, you can describe exactly how the tabla is to be played. They don't have that in Western music. A tabla is a kettle drum, a small, actually two kettle drums, kind of like bongos, only larger and not connected. Fun. So, now that we've had our little fun, we've done our review of the homework, I thought what I'd do is talk to you a little bit about a more advanced topic in signal processing, and this has to do with what's called multi-resolution signal processing. In multi-resolution signal processing, we try and address some of the inherent disadvantages that we see in using the short-time Fourier transform. And in order to do that, we get away from using elementary sine waves to do our analysis. So one thing that characterizes all Fourier transforms, whether they be continuous or discrete, is that we make the assumption that a sine wave and a sine wave taken 90 degrees out of phase, which we sometimes call a cosine wave, are used as the basis functions. Instead, what I'd like to propose is that we have what's called a filter bank as the basis function. And the reason that is compelling is the filter bank allows us to gradually improve our resolution as a function of time. So if the original signal is up here on the upper left, that's Lena, then a one-level Haar transform will give us Lena, the low-pass filtered version of the image, which is smaller in number of pixels, that is lower resolution, but it'll also give us what we need in order to increase the resolution and make the image look better. And these are the subbands on the other. These are three subbands in what's called a Haar filter. So Haar filter gives us a low-pass version of the original. It gives us details that allow us to recover the original. And then as time passes, we can send more details, and the original will get better and better looking until you get back to the original image. Here it is again with a spline, and here are our several multi-resolution Haar filters. You could transmit this small image, use pixel duplication at the receiver, and get a large image of low resolution, and then improve its resolution as you send more detail. That multi-resolution format is very popular with image compression people, because what happens is you get a lot of coherence in these subbands, a lot of areas of dark that you can run lengthen code or efficiently code with code books. It turns out this is how it looks in 2 dimensions, but you can do it in any number of dimensions, and for us in our one-dimensional signal processing world, we'll be wanting to do this in 1 dimension. So the way I like to think of it is you have a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter. And the low-pass filter passes all the frequencies below a certain cutoff, and the high-pass filter passes all the frequencies above a certain cutoff. And then what you do is you take the low-pass filtered frequencies and you recursively transform them again. And now you have on the low-pass side low-pass, low-pass, and low-pass, high-pass. And then on the high-pass side you have low-pass, high-pass, low-pass, and high-pass, high-pass. And so by recursively subdividing the subbands, you can continuously create more and more subband filters, which can be then used for transmission and reconstruction. What do you think of that? So that's basic idea anyways. All the rest is detail. So now comes the big interesting thing. Well, if I take a string of numbers and I form a low-pass filter, let's say I started with 2 numbers and I do a low-pass filter, how many numbers will I have when I'm done? What does a low-pass filter look like with 2 numbers? What is a low-pass filter? How do I do that? Yeah, I mean how physically? Let's say I have Excel. Okay, here's Microsoft Excel. Okay, I'm going to create a sequence. Okay, so this is an arbitrary sequence. I'm just going to create a sequence of numbers. Prior number plus 1. Okay, how many numbers do we need for this? Like, I don't know, 10 or something? Okay, so now I've got an input signal. How do I do the low-pass filter? Yes, sir. Say it louder. An if statement. No, I don't need an if statement. I'll just say that this is equal to that plus this divided by 2. And I'll put it in parentheses. It's an average, right? Low-pass filter is an average. So that's going to be one of those things I guess, does this work? Oh yeah. So there's my low-pass filtering. So the low-pass filtering for adjacent items as you go through this is going to essentially allow me to, I'll say, create a new signal with a little bit less variance. So then you say, but it looks like the same kind of signal. It's got the same general trend. And I say, yeah, that's probably because there is no sudden change in the value. Let's make a sudden change in the value. Let's put like an 8 in here. And now what we'll do is we'll see, yeah, we're gradually going up, and that's fine, but then it doesn't look like we're going up as quick as we would otherwise. Right? That sudden change from 3 to 8 kind of got a little bit more gradual. So we ramped up to that change from 3 to 8. And in fact, if I said, well, let's not make it 80, let's make it 90, right? The change from 3 to 90 was kind of low-pass filtered out. And if we go from 90 back to, let's say, 20, right, the change from 3 to 90 was kind of sudden. The change from 91 to 20 was kind of sudden, but when we look to the right, we ramped up to a change in 90 with a small intermediate value, 46. And we ramped down from 91 to 20 with a small intermediate value, 55. So we low-pass filtered the changes by doing a piecewise averaging. Very simple, right? So that small change, that I'll say the more gradual change allowed us to low-pass filter or alter some of the high-frequency stuff that's going on in this numeric series. What do you think of that? So that's a low-pass filter, piecewise averaging. But it's got a problem. And what's the problem? Well, the way I see it, the problem is it's giving me floating points when I started with integers. Right? What do I do about that? Round. Or isn't there a trunk or a lower? No. How do you do how do you truncate? Trunk?
You can get rid of decimal points.
I think trunk. Truncates the number to an integer.
On top, under general, I think you can just choose like whole number. You can choose how many decimal places you want to carry it out to under general.
I know how many decimal places I want. I just want to take off the floating bit. And that does that. Trunk. That's an Excel thing. You know, in Java, we would just do the numeric computation by taking 2 and dividing it into the number, and then it automatically does trunk unless we're starting with a floating point number. So that's fine, but I got another problem. If I'm going to send, I want the high pass filter stuff too. How am I going to get the high pass filter? Well, I'll set that number here, and I'll subtract off the difference between that and this. So if I do that, and then I start to run that through, I can get the details. And now it's key. The high pass filter and the low pass filter are complementary with respect to one another, right? And we can see sudden changes are being shown with large numbers. Not only that, but it comes out as being a relatively integral operation. So that's cool. I like that. But if I have to send both the low pass side and the high pass side, that's not good. So now what I need to do is I need to decimate the quantities. I have to basically take every other number and call that the low pass, and then over in here I have to take every other number and just transmit that as the high pass. And if you do that, you will have done what's called a lifting Haar transform. And that's the first level lifting Haar transform. Pretty cool, right? You could do it all in Excel. We don't need stinking Java for this. Gesundheit. And you could certainly do that in MATLAB. In fact, there's a wavelet toolbox in MATLAB that does just that. Pretty slick, right? Let's see if this works. Yep. So this is what you get when you do it with images. And in fact, if you do it recursively, you get these subbands over in here. And you can see why decimation would actually cause the image to look smaller, because what you're doing when you're taking every other item is you're basically reducing the total number of points in the sample. So if you want to do a reconstruction just on the low pass filter after a single pass, you've got to insert the numbers and duplicate them. Right? So in other words, it works this way. That would be equal to this, and the next one would be equal also to that, and then this would be equal to this, and the next one would be equal to the same thing, and you'd keep duplicating the numbers. And if you really wanted to change it back to the original, you'd need these details in order to reconstruct the original. So this would give you the same length formula, but with duplications. But in fact, what you transmit is only 1, 46, 55, 21, 23. It's kind of hard to do this in Excel. 25, 27, and 14. So those would just be the low pass coefficients that you would transmit. And then at the receiver you would have to duplicate them to get a, I'll call it first pass at what the original signal looks like without the details. Is that sort of making sense? So, what about those time series? There's a guy who does, he's actually here in Connecticut. He self-publishes books. He's a Yale professor, and his name is Tuft. And what he did was a survey, and he said, sampling 4,000 graphs from 15 newspapers, most of everything he sees is time series. So it's Dow Jones graphs, or plots of this as a function of time, things like population as a function of time, things like that. Time series is very common. And so when you start to think about time series and working with it, the question is, over what period of time should you examine things? Someone said, oh, the stock market is up. Well, over the right time scale, the stock market is always up, right? Because if you look at back to the 20s, the stock market was in the single digits, and if you go back to the beginning, it starts out at being like less than 10, and now it's grown to something like 15,000, right, for the Dow. And so over the right time scale, the stock market is always up. Go over a 10-year time scale, and the stock market is up. Now, I don't know what's going to happen next week. I can't tell you that, but 10 years from now, stock market will be up. So if you go 10 years before and that sort of thing, you can see the stock market is a lot less than it is now. So that's a key element. But then the question is, over what period of time should you be working? So that's very important for us. And when we're looking for patterns, we need to know that. So by having, and this is one of the reasons we use these Hurst exponents, right? They give us exponents that allow us to deal with different time scales. So Fourier had this idea that time would start at minus infinity and go to plus infinity. And we do an analysis on a waveform that's truly periodic, and use the sine waves for doing the analysis, enables us to start with basis functions, which are sine waves, that start at time equals minus infinity and go to time equals plus infinity. And that's a very fine idea if you accept the assumption that the waveform that you're trying to analyze is periodic and started at time equals minus infinity. That assumption is probably untrue for the vast majority of all signals you'll ever encounter ever. Right? It's like the assumption you started with when you were in Physics 1 and they said, let's assume the system is linear. And you're like, okay, we'll assume that now, but guess what? In the real world, nothing is linear. You know, and if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because nonlinear stuff is everywhere, but if you only have elementary math tools, you can't do the analysis with nonlinear stuff. You need computers for that. So then, somewheres around 1910, Haar, and that's over here. Here's Jean-Baptiste Fourier and his analysis ideas. Here comes Haar saying, look, we're going to use basis functions that have very short periods in duration. Exactly the opposite assumption from Fourier. Now we're going to make the assumption that things have finite time, that these are events and we want to do the analysis on them. So we're going to use short time basis functions that do not begin at time equal minus infinity and end at time equal plus infinity. They end at one little time t0, they start at one little time t0 and end at another little time t1, and that's it. And what we'll do is we'll dilate these functions and increase the time or decrease the time in order to be able to precisely identify when the event has occurred. So this is a time dilation expression right in here, and it's some sort of function of this parameter, and the parameter is being shown as a function of t, the dummy variable, and then it's being subtracted from 2 to the n, where n is in the number of samples. So you're assuming you have, what do we call this, an integral power of 2 samples being used to dilate this analysis function. So that's a key element. And we talked a little bit before about the uncertainty principle, right? We talked about how you could have resolution in time or resolution in frequency, and they two traded off with one another. And Heisenberg said, look, if you want to be able to compute the momentum versus the position, you can be more precise in one but less precise in the other. In other words, if I want to know how fast you went when you came to school today, I can't just look at your speedometer at any given instant of time. I have to know over what distance you traversed and how long it took it. And now if you said, well, I started in New Haven and I drove to Fairfield and it took me 20 minutes, I could say, well, you know what? Your average speed was probably somewhere on the order of, let's say, round numbers, 40 miles an hour. Oh, but I went 80 miles an hour on I-95. Yes, I'm sure you did. But your average speed, right, is what we really care about, and we couldn't get that unless we knew over a long distance what your speed was. So instantaneous speed was not meaningful for you in your commute. The only meaningful speed you could get was your average speed. Same thing with computing momentum versus position. I really have to measure things over a long distance in order to get true momentum. That's what Heisenberg's point was. So Gabor comes in and says, look, I've got this short-time Fourier transform, and we did this for the spectrogram, and he said, you know what, we've got fixed window sizes. That's got a big disadvantage for us because we really don't know what it is we're trying to analyze. If we know in advance, we can compute the window size, or at least change the sample rate. So then comes this idea about the wavelet transforms. And what you see over in here is the classic decimation filter. This says we'll take every other sample. That's what the down arrow by 2 means. And we're going to have the low pass filter, that's the A, the average, which we saw as being 2 adjacent samples divided by 2. And we'll have the detail, that's 2 adjacent samples subtracted. And then we'll have the decimation. I'm looking for my cursor. Oh, here it is. And so the decimation has to be done for both the low pass and the high pass filters, both for the low pass and the details. And so then what we'll have is the same number of samples when we're done, and the ability to reconstruct. We pass these samples over to the receiver, and what it does is it upsamples, it duplicates, and then it interleaves the duplicated samples from the details, and then it adds the two together and gives us the original signal. So why should we do that? And the answer is because this stream up in the top and the stream down in the bottom are very susceptible to efficient coding. They also enable us to transmit the low pass first and then the high pass so that we can proceed to have an image that we can see and then have it get better as a function of time. And the reason why we'd like it to get better as a function of time is because we would like to be able to communicate from the receiver to the transmitter the quality of service we're able to obtain. That means the bandwidth. So if what you did was you told me, look, I really don't have the bandwidth to listen to your radio station with full CD quality, you can back off and only transmit the low-pass details, the low-pass filter, and leave off some of the high end, and I'll still be able to understand your radio. So if you said, I'm listening to the radio on my telephone modem or whatever, my low bandwidth connection, this should be able to adjust for that. This gives us the ability to turn down the fidelity without causing hiccups in the stream. So when you're doing what I'll call streaming multimedia transmissions, a multi-resolution streaming multimedia transition gives you the ability to turn down the resolution so that you can turn down fidelity and still get a continuous streaming feed. That might be so important for certain kinds of things where it's perfectly acceptable to drop bits. For example, let's say video, if you drop bits, you start to get a little digital schmutz, but maybe you'll still be able to see stuff and it'll recover nicely. So Fourier was a contemporary of Gauss, lived to his, I think 77 is what that comes out to be, and so did Gauss, oddly enough. So they both lived to be nice, ripe old ages. And the Fourier transform allowed us to get these Fourier coefficients that serve as the amplitude for each one of the waveform numbers. And so the wave numbers are on the left with the different frequencies, and the Fourier coefficients are a sub k and b sub k. So these are the cosine plus the cosine with a shift of 90 degrees, also known as sine. And at specific frequency, wave number k, these are the wave numbers. And so those things can be added together to give us an arbitrarily complex waveform. And that is known as the principle of superposition, which says you add up enough components of the sine wave and cosine wave, and eventually you'll get back to where you were. Adding these things together with different amplitudes to get their original complex function is a kind of synthesis. What kind of synthesis is it? It's constructive synthesis. Starting with a complex waveform and coming back to a different waveform by subtracting out using filtering is another kind of synthesis. What kind of synthesis is that? It's destructive synthesis. Okay, I was just trying to see if you guys are paying any attention at all. So, yeah, two kinds of synthesis. You can do this with modeling as well. If you're modeling a complicated system and you keep adding terms to account for more things that are happening in the model that you hadn't accounted for prior to this, that's called constructive modeling. If you start with a very complicated expression like a Navier-Stokes equation, which is used for arbitrary fluid dynamics, and you subtract off terms that you may not need, let's say terms for turbulence, that's called destructive modeling. So you can do constructive modeling or destructive modeling. They're both valid. Is it time for a demo? Probably. Demo. Demo, 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 demo. Okay, let's do a demo. So, what do we got here? Lifting. I have lifting. Liftoff. So here is the forward and reverse Haar transforms being implemented recursively. So the recursive input signal, let's see if I can do this. Here's the input signal. What it does is it terminates if n is less than 2. There has to be more than 2 samples. Here's n on 2. And we use that for the new subbands, the low pass and the detail. That's the high pass. I do the low pass and high pass computations with a copy, and then I proceed to do the subtraction and the averaging. And here you can see we're taking the detail and dividing it by 2, and that we add to the low pass filter. This allows us to maintain what's called an integer transform, which is a little bit different than what we saw in Excel. And then we can get a backward Haar transform by doing a very similar operation, and that'll give us the ability to... Oh, I'm running the wrong thing. Yeah, got to run the right program. There. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that in the back, Rich? Kevin, you can see this? I could change resolution if it helps, but it kind of messes up my screen capture. So what I was thinking is, here's my input signal on the top, 1, 2, 251, blah, blah, blah. And now here's what I transmit. And so I've got a low pass coefficient and a detail, low pass coefficient and detail, low pass detail, low pass detail, and now it turns out I can do a perfect reconstruction coming back to the original signal, which is pretty cool actually. And so what I thought was interesting about this is that no floating point numbers were transmitted at all. You know, that's a big win for me, because if I have to start transmitting floating point numbers, then all of a sudden the amount of data that I'm transmitting is a lot bigger than the amount of data that I started with, if what I'm starting with is integers. Now, as you may know, whenever you do an A to D conversion on any real signal, what comes out, in general, is an integer, because you're getting, you know, so many bits only. What happens is it all gets converted into an integer with that many bits. Nobody ever writes it out. Like you're digitizing a 16-bit quantity, they say, okay, it's a number that ranges from 0 to 65,536. You're done. You don't try and convert that to a floating point number. On the other hand, what we did with our ulog coder is we came out with an array of doubles. And it's perfectly acceptable to do a floating point hard transform. But if you do it with integers, they call it integer lifting, and it allows you to avoid having to deal with double precision numbers entirely. And so that's why I consider that a feature. It's particularly important in image processing, because in image processing, a pixel is generally an 8-bit quantity in red, an 8-bit quantity in green, and an 8-bit quantity in blue. So in general, you have 3 8-bit quantities, red, green, and blue, and that gives you 24 bits. One thing you don't want is 3 floating point numbers, because that would really kill your memory, especially if you're dealing with megapixel images. And in general, we are, because almost every camera is megapixel nowadays. So if you want to run this, you can find it under math.wavelets under lifting. And I just thought that was a pretty cool way to go. What do you think of that? Yes, sir.
I have one question. The example you had up before, your original data and the transition were the same amount of things, like numbers, right?
Right. I wasn't doing any compression.
Okay.
All right. If I was doing compression, I would try and take advantage of the inter-sample coherence available in the details and in the low-pass filter, either by virtue of transmitting a code book that would take advantage of the fact that there were a lot of numbers that were similar in a row, or by using some kind of arithmetic coding. We haven't really talked about coding theory at all in the course. That's a whole other thing. Big deal kind of thing. So we can try this with different numbers if you want. Let's see how many numbers we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I actually should probably just do this here. How does one do this? It says out Control J, enter n equals end quote plus input dot length. I was going to sit here and count them, but then I said, hey, wait, computers are good at that. I should just let the computer do it. So it says there's 9 here. So it's not an integral power of 2. Pretty cool, right? And it's working anyways. So I should be able to insert another number. Blech. Oh, wait, maybe that's kind of big. Here, I'll put it in that one and see how that works. Yeah, works good. Now, if all the numbers were less than 127, yeah, I could probably fit all of these numbers into standard Java bytes without any troubles, because standard Java bytes range from minus 128 to plus 127. Bytes in Java are always signed. If you know the range is larger, you'll need a larger primitive data type. But I like the idea of keeping everything integer and using bytes. Then I could just take all of the data and pack it. And if you think about it, I could probably pack 4 of the bytes into a single int and transmit the int if I wanted. Or just transmit a stream as an unformatted sequence of bytes, and then get my reconstruction happening. That worked pretty good, actually. What do you think? Good, right? Works and everything. Time for a break? Alright, let's take a break. I'll turn off this media player. It's somewhere in here.